$30. I have told this story so many times now to reporters, to county officials, to strangers who drove 4 hours just to stand at the edge of Crane's Landing and look out at what we built. And every single time I start with that number, $30. Because that is where everything begins. That is the price of the rest of my life. I didn't know that, of course. Not when I was 17 years old and standing in the cold January air with my kid brother shivering beside me and 47 crumpled dollars in my coat pocket. I didn't know that the rusty, half-rotted houseboat sitting out on that frozen dock was anything more than a last desperate gamble. I didn't know that a dead man's years of grief and preparation were sitting 40 paces beneath the Nebraska earth waiting for exactly this moment. I didn't know any of it, but I do now. And I want to tell you what those $30 bought, not just for Sully and me, but for the 25 people who are alive today because of what was buried beneath that boat. I want to tell you about Captain Cord Mallory, who lost everything he loved and spent the rest of his life making sure it wouldn't happen to someone else. I want to tell you about the letter he left behind, about the mission he passed to a 17-year-old girl with red hair and nothing left to lose. I want to tell you how $30 changed the course of everything. But to get there, I have to take you back. Back to the morning guard Durbin threw us out. The morning started the way most mornings did in that house, with the sound of a bottle. I heard it before I was fully awake, the familiar clink of glass against the kitchen counter, the scrape of cabinet doors opened and closed with too much force, the particular shuffle of a man who had been drinking since before the sun came up. Guard Durbin's movements had a pattern to them, a rhythm I had learned to read the way other people learned to read weather. The way the old farmers outside of Benton Falls could look at the color of the January sky and know without any particular science to it what was coming. That morning, the sky outside our bedroom window was the wrong kind of gray. Not the flat, heavy gray of ordinary Nebraska winter. This was a gray that had something in it, a yellow undertone barely visible like a bruise just beginning to form beneath the skin of the clouds. The kind of gray that sits in the air like a held breath. I lay in my bed for a moment and listened to guard downstairs, and I felt it, that particular heaviness in the atmosphere. That meant this morning was different from other mornings. Different in the way that mattered. Sully was still asleep in the bed across from mine. He slept the way he always slept, flat on his back, with one arm thrown out to the side, his dark hair pushed up at odd angles from the pillow. He was 15 years old, tall for his age, with shoulders that had started to fill out in a way that meant he would be broad someday, like our father had been, or so people said. I was too young when our father left to have any real memory of him. But people in town said Sully had his build, and I suppose that was true, even if it wasn't the kind of inheritance anyone would have chosen. There was still something young about Sully's face when he was asleep, something that hadn't hardened yet, something that still believed down in the quiet place where beliefs live before the world has had enough time to work on them, that people were basically decent if you waited long enough. I had stopped believing that a long time ago. Somewhere in the 3 years since our mother died, that particular belief had gone quiet in me, and I had not missed it much. You couldn't afford it. Not in this house. I got up quietly. I dressed in the dim cold of the room. The heating in that house was bad, had been bad for years, and in January it was just something you lived with. The cold that crept in at the baseboards and settled into the bones of the place like an uninvited tenant who knew he wasn't welcome but refused to leave. I pulled on my jeans, my sweater, my heaviest socks. My red hair was tangled from sleep, and I pulled it back roughly without a mirror. There was no time for mirrors. I went to wake Sully. He groaned at the first touch on his shoulder, turned away, groaned again. "School," I said. He complied the way he always did, with a slow theatrical reluctance that I had long since identified as performance, because Sully actually liked school. He liked the structure of it, liked having somewhere to be that wasn't this house, like the particular freedom of a place where his intelligence was visible and valued, and nobody looked at him like a burden somebody else had forgotten to pick up. He was good at things, drawing mathematics, the kind of quiet precision in his hands that could hold a pencil for hours without getting tired and produce something at the end of it that looked exactly like the thing he had been imagining. He just wasn't willing to admit to any of that enthusiasm at 6:30 in the morning when there was a warm bed involved. We dressed and went downstairs. Guard was in the kitchen. He was standing at the counter with his back to us, one hand braced against the edge, like he needed the support. The kitchen smelled the way it always smelled: old coffee, cheap cigarettes, the faint underneath smell of beer that had soaked into the walls over years and become part of the house itself, as much a fixture as the cracked linoleum and the drawer that never quite closed. He didn't turn around when we came in. That was different. Most mornings, Guard at least acknowledged us in the way that a man acknowledges furniture, with a kind of passing awareness that said, yes, you exist, you are taking up space, I'm aware of your presence, and I have decided not to be actively inconvenienced by it at this moment. But that morning he kept his back to us, staring at something on the counter, and his shoulders were set in a way I had never seen before. Not drunk loose, not the slack, sloppy posture of a man who had been at the bottle since before dawn. This was tight, wire tight, the posture of someone holding themselves very still around something that might break. I said nothing. I reached past him for the cereal box on the counter. I poured 2 bowls. Sully and I stood at the counter and ate in silence because Guard didn't like us sitting at the table. He had never explained this particular rule. It was simply one of the invisible lines that defined the geography of living in this house, one of the boundaries that shifted and moved depending on his mood and the hour and the depth of whatever was in the bottle, and the safest thing to do had always been to find the line and stay on the right side of it. We gathered our books. I helped Sully find his math homework, which had somehow ended up under his pillow. It did this frequently, as though it was searching for somewhere comfortable to rest. I checked my own bag. We headed for the front door. That was when Guard stepped in front of us. He had moved without sound. That was the thing about Guard Durbin, and for a large man, for a man with 200 pounds on him and liquor in his blood, he could move with an alarming absence of noise when he wanted to. He was standing between us and the door, and in his right hand he was holding an envelope. His hands were shaking. Not from alcohol. I knew the difference by then, the loose, sloppy tremor of too much whiskey, and this other thing which was the tremor of a man standing at the edge of a decision that has already been made and cannot be unmade. You two need to get your things, he said. His voice was flat, almost calm. The kind of calm that is not peace, but the place on the other side of something that used to be anger. Sully looked at me. I looked at Guard. What do you mean? I asked. He threw the envelope on the floor between us. Papers spilled out across the linoleum, official-looking papers. Papers with bank letterheads and stamped seals, and the kind of dense legal language that means something irreversible has already been set into motion. I mean, get your things and get out. You've got 1 hour. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet, just slightly, just enough to remind me that it could. I kept my voice steady. I had practice with that. 3 years of practice. Guard. The full version of his name, the one I used when I needed him to hear me as a person speaking to another person and not just as noise in the room. What are you talking about? He laughed. It was a sound without any warmth in it anywhere, not even the hollow warmth of humor aimed at misfortune, not the kind of laugh that acknowledges absurdity. It was the laugh of a man who has passed through anger into something on the other side of anger, something colder and more resigned. The laugh of a man who has nothing left to protect. I lost the house, Ellie. Poker debt. Bank is taking it in 48 hours. I'm not spending my last night in this dump babysitting 2 kids who aren't even mine. Sully's voice came out from just behind my left shoulder, small in a way that I had not heard from him in a long time. Where are we supposed to go? Guard shrugged. The gesture was enormous in its indifference. The way a wall shrugs when you hit it. The way weather shrugs when you ask it to stop. Not my problem. You're 17, he said, pointing at me. Figure it out. I wanted to say so many things in that moment. I wanted to say the money the state sent you every month for our care, the $342 per child that was supposed to go toward food and clothing, and the basic dignity of being alive. Where did that go? What did that buy? I wanted to say. Our mother died in a hospital bed weighing 80 pounds, and she married you because she was lonely. And lonely people make choices they would not otherwise make, and you turned her trust into poker chips. I wanted to say all of it loudly in a voice that would reach every corner of this house and come back off the walls and mean something. I didn't say any of it, because I had learned over 3 years that there was no point. Guard Durbin was a wall, not the kind of wall you can find a door in or wear down gradually with patience, or knock over if you find the right angle. The solid kind. The kind that simply stands there, and you can beat yourself against it until you have nothing left, and it remains standing, and you are the one who is broken. I had watched my mother discover this truth slowly over the 2 years of their marriage, and I had no interest in relearning it at her expense. So instead, I turned around. I put my hand on Sully's arm. "Come on," I said, "let's pack." We had 1 hour to gather everything that mattered out of 17 years of my life and 15 years of Sully's. There wasn't much. There had never been much. We had never been people who accumulated things, partly because we had never had the money for it, and partly because things in this house had a way of disappearing, absorbed into Guard's various needs and habits, the way everything else eventually was. I went to my closet first. I went to the back corner and I worked up the loose floorboard I had found the first winter we lived here. The board that didn't quite line up with the others, the one that had a hollow space beneath it, just large enough to hold the things I needed to keep out of Guard's reach. That was where I kept the things that mattered. The photograph of our mother, the one from her wedding to our real father before everything, before cancer and Guard, and the slow disassembly of the life she had built. She was laughing in the photograph, her head thrown back slightly, her hair loose and red, and lit up in the afternoon sun, the same color as mine, the color I had always thought of as inconvenient and she had always called beautiful. She was 31 in that photograph. She looked like someone who expected good things. I packed the photograph in the inside pocket of my coat close to my chest where it would be protected. I packed clothes 2 changes, what would fit in the canvas bag I'd been given by the Methodist Church clothing drive 2 winters back. A wool blanket. The $47 I had saved from odd jobs around the neighborhood mowing lawns in summer, shoveling walks in winter, helping Mrs. Delaney with her groceries when her arthritis was bad. $47, everything I had. Across the hall I could hear Sully packing, methodical, quiet. When I looked in on him, he had his sketchbook in his hands, turning it over, slowly running his thumb along the spiral, binding the way he always did when he was thinking about something he wasn't ready to say yet. He had been filling that sketchbook for the better part of 2 years. Nearly every page was covered pencil sketches of things he had seen and things he had imagined and things that seemed to exist somewhere in the space between diagrams of structures and machinery, careful architectural drawings of buildings that didn't exist yet but felt when you looked at them like they should. He packed it at the very top of his bag where he could get to it. He packed his pencils, a small wooden box that held the last birthday card our mother had ever sent. The one that arrived 2 weeks before she went into the hospital for the last time, written in handwriting that had already started to shake, but was still unmistakably hers. He packed his library book, which was overdue, and for a moment I thought about telling him to leave it, and then I didn't, because it seemed like exactly the kind of thing you hold on to when everything else is being taken. When we walked out the front door, Guard didn't look up. He was sitting on this couch in the living room with a bottle on the cushion beside him, staring at the wall. Not at us, not at anything in particular. Like we had already disappeared. Like we were already gone and the room was already empty of us. The screen door banged shut behind us. The cold was immediate and complete. January in Nebraska is not the gentle cold of Plickies where winter arrives gradually and makes room for you to adjust. It hits you the moment you step outside flat in the face and through the coat and straight down into the bones, and it is not interested in your comfort or your plans or the fact that you are 17 years old with no coat heavy enough for what is coming. We stood on the front steps for a moment, Sully and I with our bags on our shoulders and the door shut behind us and the world gray and still and merciless, and then we walked. The first night we slept in an old equipment shed on the far edge of the Halverson property. The Halversons had owned that land for 3 generations, but the last of them had moved to Omaha when the old man died and the farm stopped making sense to anyone young enough to work it. The property sat empty the way a lot of small Nebraska farms sit empty, now not abandoned, exactly, not forgotten, just left behind by people who decided the city was a better bet than the land. The outbuildings stood in the frozen fields like old men with nowhere to be, weathered and patient and faintly reproachful. The shed smelled like rust and frozen earth and old hay. The wind came through the gaps in the boards, and there was no heat of any kind, just the cold that pressed in from all sides, with the patient certainty of something that knows it will eventually get through. but it was shelter. It blocked the worst of the wind. And that night, the wind off the flat Nebraska plain had the particular cruelty of wind that has nothing between it and you for 50 miles in every direction. We unrolled our blankets on the dirt floor, and we sat close together and we ate the granola bars I had packed at the bottom of my bag, two each, and Sully ate his quickly with the focused efficiency of a boy who is pretending not to be worried about anything. Then he sat with his back against the shed wall and stared at a middle distance that contained nothing in particular. He didn't cry. I wished he would. Not because I thought crying would fix anything I had learned years ago, that crying is a kind of luxury, something you can afford when there is someone present who will do something useful with your tears, and we had not been in that situation for a long time. But crying means you are still processing, still engaged with the reality of what has happened, still letting it move through you. Sully's stillness scared me in a way that his tears would not have. It was the stillness of someone who had closed something off and locked it down hard because opening it felt like a risk they weren't willing to take. After a while, he pulled the sketchbook out of his bag, and in the thin gray light that came through the cracks, he started drawing. I couldn't see what, just the steady scratch of his pencil quiet, and even while the wind talked around the building. I lay down and I did not sleep, and I ran the numbers in my head the way you run through a deck of cards, looking for the one card that can save you knowing before you start that the deck is short. $47. Two people. January. No legal guardian, no family to fall back on. Our mother had been an only child. Our father had left when Sully was 2 years old, gone so completely that he had left no trail worth following, no forwarding address that anyone had thought to write down. We had no aunts, no uncles, no grandparents still living. There was no net beneath us of the kind that most people don't know they have until they need it. What there was the county, the Department of Family Services, the bureaucratic machinery for handling children who had fallen through every other net, which processed them into group homes and foster placements with the practiced efficiency of an institution that was stretched thin and doing its best and nevertheless could not guarantee that two siblings placed into the system would stay together. The math didn't usually work out that way. I lay on the frozen dirt of the Halverson shed and I listened to the wind, and I made a promise to myself the way you make promises when everything is on the line and you have nothing left to lose except the thing you are promising about. I will not let that happen. Whatever it costs, however it has to work, I will not let them separate us. I did not yet know what it was going to cost. The second morning, Sully woke up with a fever, not high. When I pressed the back of my hand to his forehead, the way our mother used to an automatic gesture, I had absorbed without knowing it what I felt was warm, but not the spiking, alarming heat of a body in serious trouble. His breathing was a little shallow. He said his throat hurt. He pushed himself upright and insisted he was fine. He was not fine. He was a 15-year-old boy who had slept on a frozen dirt floor in January without enough blankets, and his body was registering a formal complaint in the only language available to it. We could not stay in that shed for another night. I helped him up. We rolled our blankets and packed our bags and walked. The county road to Benton Falls was glazed with ice from the freezing rain the night before, the kind of surface that was navigable only if you stayed to the edge, where the gravel gave some grip and kept your feet under you and didn't hurry. We walked carefully. Sully walked with his shoulders pulled in and his chin down and his hands deep in his pockets, and he didn't complain once, which was somehow worse than if he had complained constantly, because it told me something about how tired he was. Benton Falls, Nebraska. Population 3,000 and falling every decade the way small Nebraska towns fall slowly and without fanfare, losing a family here and a family there to the cities and the coast and the general drift of the country away from places where the economy depends on grain prices and the kindness of the weather. Main Street ran 6 blocks from the grain elevator at the north end to the Dollar General at the south, with everything important in between. The hardware store, the diner, the grocery, the feed shop, the post office with its hand-lettered bulletin board, the Methodist church whose donation bin had kept us in coats and jeans more than once. It was the kind of town that had worked out a quiet dignity in its smallness, a town that knew what it was and didn't try to be something else. But it was also the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's car and everyone else's business, and the particular arithmetic of other people's difficulty could be calculated with some precision by anyone who felt like doing the math. We came in off the county road and walked down Main Street and found a bench outside the diner because we needed somewhere to sit and we had just enough money to justify being somewhere near warmth, or almost. Sully leaned against my shoulder. His eyes were half closed. The cold had put red spots on his cheekbones that looked almost healthy until you noticed the gray pallor of the skin in them. I was thinking, running through options the way you run through possibilities when you know the list is short and getting shorter. The patrol car pulled up to the curb with the slow, deliberate patience of someone who has seen this kind of situation before and has already decided how the conversation is going to go. Sheriff Dale Bowen. I had seen him around town over the years, a large man broad through the shoulders with gray hair, cut close, and a face that had settled into the expression of someone who has spent 20 years dealing with other people's emergencies and has learned to process them without letting them reach the part of himself where things still register as painful. He was not unkind, but he was thorough and he was precise, and he had a way of looking at a situation that suggested he was seeing considerably more of it than you were showing him. He got out of the car slowly. He hitched up his belt. He walked over to where we were sitting with the unhurried stride of a man who is in no danger of losing the thread of what he came here for. He looked at me first, then at Sully, then back at me. "Ellie Ward," he said, not a question, a statement of a fact that had already been confirmed. "Sheriff." He was quiet for a moment, long enough that I could hear the sounds behind the diner window. The clink of coffee cups, the murmur of conversation, the warmth of somewhere we were not. "Got a call this morning," he said. "Guard Durbin says you and your brother took off. Says he's been worried." I had expected something like this, but hearing it put so plainly the image of Guard Durbin at a telephone performing the language of concern for someone else's benefit, something tightened in my chest that had nothing to do with the cold. I kept my voice level. "He kicked us out. He lost the house to gambling debt. The bank is taking it in 2 days, and he told us we had an hour to pack and leave." The sheriff's expression did not change in any visible way. It simply held waiting the way a man holds himself when he has heard many versions of many stories and knows that patience is more useful than response. "That may be," he said carefully, "but you're both minors. Without a legal guardian, I'm obligated to contact family services." Beside me, Sully's hand found my coat sleeve. His fingers gripped it. I knew what family services meant. I'd always known the way you know about things you have spent considerable effort not looking at directly, not because you are afraid of the knowledge, but because looking at it might make it real, and making it real might make it happen. It meant processing. It meant placements. It meant group homes and temporary foster situations in the particular mathematics of a system stretched beyond its capacity that could not guarantee as a matter of policy that two siblings placed into it would end up in the same building, let alone the same room. "It means foster care," the sheriff said, looking at Sully, whose face had gone very still. "Could be you two get placed together. Could be you don't." The silence after those words was the loudest thing I had heard in a long time. I stood up. "We have a place to stay." The sheriff's eyes came back to me, that measuring look. And here is where I can't fully explain what happened. I have thought about this moment many times in the years since, tried to understand exactly what made me say what I said next, where the words came from. The most honest answer I have is that I didn't choose them. They were simply there already, already leaving my mouth before any conscious part of me had decided to say them. My grandmother left me a property, down by the river, a boat. It's ours. Sully's hand on my sleeve had changed its character. It was no longer gripping out of fear. It had become a question. "What boat?" the sheriff asked. Something in his voice had sharpened fractionally. "The old houseboat at Crane's Landing." I had passed that dock 100 times over the years, always at the margin of my vision, always registered and immediately forgotten, the way things you don't own are forgotten. The rotting wooden structure tied to an unused dock at the bend in the river, visible from the county road if you knew where to look. I had never once thought of it as connected to me in any way. I didn't know who owned it, or whether it was structurally sound, or whether it would still be there if I walked out to look at it. What I had was a direction, and $47, and a brother running a fever. Nobody's been using it. It sat there for years after she passed, but it was in her name, and she left it to me. Every word a fabrication. I had no grandmother who had left me anything. I had no grandmother at all as far as I knew. I had no claim on that houseboat. I did not know its history. I did not know what I was going to find when I got there, if it was still standing, if there was anything to find. What I had was a direction to point in. The sheriff studied me for a very long time, long enough that the silence became its own kind of pressure. I held his gaze without looking away, kept my face still, kept my breathing, even kept every sign of what was actually happening inside me below the surface where it couldn't be read. Finally, slowly, he nodded. "I'll be checking on that," he said. "You've got 72 hours to show me proof of ownership. If you can't produce it, I'm making the call." He held my gaze for one more moment. Then he walked back to his car and drove away. Sully looked at me. His voice was very quiet. "Ellie, we don't own that boat." "I know. So what do we do?" I took a long breath of cold Nebraska air. I looked down the street at the town hall building at the corner of Main and Cedar Brick. Front brass directory plate. The particular official solidity of a building that processes facts. "We're going to buy it," I said. The town hall smelled like old paper and floor wax and recycled radiator air. The universal smell of government work done in buildings that were built before anyone thought about ventilation. A woman named Doris sat behind the front counter at a computer that looked older than some of the documents she was responsible for typing with 2 fingers in the slow, deliberate way of someone who had learned the skill from an instruction manual and seen no reason to deviate from the manual since. She did not look up when we came in. "Help you." "I need to ask about a property," I said. "The old houseboat at Crane's Landing." That made her look up. She had the look of someone who takes inventory quickly and without apology. My wrinkled clothes, my unwashed hair, the canvas bags over both our shoulders, the posture of 2 people trying to occupy as little space as possible. She read all of it in about 4 seconds. "You want that thing? I want to know if it's for sale." She held my gaze for a moment, then turned to a filing cabinet behind her. She pulled out a folder, opened. It ran her finger down a page with the practiced efficiency of someone who knows where everything is and is used to being the person who remembers. Properties listed under a Cord Mallory, passed away approximately 5 years back. No surviving heirs on record. Town took possession for unpaid property taxes. She squinted at a line near the bottom of the page. Assessed value is essentially zero. It's scrap is what it is. Listed it 3 times over the years, and nobody's shown any interest. "How much to transfer the title?" She looked at me again. A different kind of look. The inventory look was gone. Something else had come into her face, something that might have been the last remaining trace of softness in a woman who had been doing paperwork for a long time. $30, she said. "That'll cover the filing fees and the transfer." I set my bag down on the counter. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the money I had been counting and recounting in my head for the past 18 hours, bills that had been folded and refolded until they were soft at the creases. I laid $30 on the counter. 30 out of 47. $17 left for everything that came after. Doris looked at the money. She looked at me. She looked at Sully standing very still at my side. She stamped a form. She signed something. She slid a piece of paper across the counter. "Congratulations," she said without any enthusiasm whatsoever. "You now own one very old houseboat." We turned toward the door. But her voice came again, quieter than before, a different register, entirely not the voice she used for official transactions, but something else. "That boat." She paused. I turned back. "The Mallory boat. You should know. There are stories about it." "What kind of stories?" She seemed to weigh something, as though deciding how much of what she knew was hers to give away. "Old Cord Mallory lived on that thing for over 20 years. Never let anyone come aboard. Never told a soul what he was doing out there. Some people said he was eccentric. Some people said he was grieving after his wife died." She paused again. "Could be nothing. Could be something. I just thought you should know." Could be nothing. Could be something. Sully and I walked out into the January cold with the deed to a houseboat folded in my coat pocket and $17 between us and everything that came next. Crane's Landing was 2 miles out of town on a dirt road that had not been properly maintained since the last flood raised the property values enough to make it not worth fixing and then lowered them enough to make it not worth fixing again. In summer, it was rough. In January, after a week of alternating freeze and thaw, it was a narrow track of frozen ruts and ice patches that required you to watch your feet constantly and trust nothing underfoot. We walked it carefully. Sully a half step behind me, his breathing audible in the cold. The fields on either side were flat and white and completely still, the particular stillness of a Nebraska winter landscape that looks like the world has been paused midway through some larger process and left to wait. The road ended at a wooden dock jutting out into a wide bend of the Missouri River. The river here was serious water, wide and gray and sluggish in winter, its edges armored with ice that extended 15 feet from the bank before giving way to open current, dark and slow and cold as it moved between its banks, with the patient indifference of something that has been doing this for a very long time and expects to keep doing it after everything on the banks is gone. And tied to the dock with ropes that had been straining for years, sitting low and still in the gray water, was the houseboat. I had seen it dozens of times at a distance, always registered as background, never looked at directly as a thing in itself. Standing at the end of that dock and looking at it for the first time as something that belonged to us, for the first time as something that had a claim on the rest of my life, required a complete adjustment of everything I thought I knew. It was bigger than I had registered from the road. 65 feet, maybe more. 2 stories. The wood was weathered to a deep silver gray, all trace of original paint, surrendered long ago to years of sun and ice, and the slow, patient work of weather on everything left unprotected. The windows were cracked. The roof sagged in 2 places where support structures had quietly failed under the accumulated weight of winters. Bird nests occupied the upper railing in abundance built over years and layers of evidence of many generations of birds who had found the place and seen no reason to look further. But the frame was solid. I could see that even from the dock, even with everything else working against the impression. The hull sat steady in the water level, not listing, not settling at any angle that suggested the kind of structural failure that is already too advanced to address. The walls were straight and true. Whatever Captain Cord Mallory had built this boat, from whatever care or craft or simple stubborn pride he had put into its construction, it had held. Through years of neglect and seasons of ice, and the total absence of anyone who gave it any attention at all, it had held. Sully stood beside me and looked at it for a long moment. "Home sweet home," he said quietly. It was the first attempt at humor he had made in 2 days. The first crack in the particular stillness he had been carrying since we walked out of Guard Durbin's house. Something in my chest moved, a knot that had been pulled too tight, finally beginning, very slightly, to ease. "Come on," I said. We climbed aboard. The deck announced itself under our feet, a long, slow groan of wood under pressure, each step finding its own note in the sequence. But nothing gave way. The door to the main cabin was unlocked. It swung inward on hinges stiffened by years without movement, releasing a groan like something waking from a sleep it hadn't intended to take. Inside, darkness first. The windows were dirty enough that the January light came through them, only dimly touching surfaces without illuminating them, suggesting shapes without confirming them. The smell was old wood and cold river air, and the dry, settled dust of a space that had been sealed for a long time. But underneath those things, underneath the neglect, there was something else. Something harder to name. Not a smell exactly, more like a quality in the air, a sense of intention, of a space that had been built with purpose and kept in some way that purpose, even through all the years of abandonment. We stepped inside. The main cabin was larger than the exterior had prepared me for, built by someone who had thought carefully about the relationship between space and use, who had made different choices than the ones you make when you're putting something together quickly or cheaply. A small kitchen area on the left, its cabinets hand-built with the kind of careful fitted joinery that takes time and patience and a certain quiet pride in the quality of what you're making. A sitting area on the right with 2 built-in benches, the cushions long gone but the frame solid and well-proportioned. A narrow staircase in the back leading up to the second floor. Everything covered in dust and cobwebs in the gray accumulation of years of stillness. But the cabinets were hand-built. The floors were real wood planked and fitted with care. In the corner, a small potbelly stove with an actual flue, the kind of stove that, given fuel and time, would heat this space efficiently for hours. The kind that someone who was planning to live somewhere for the long term would install. Someone had cared about this place. A long time ago, someone had cared about it with real thoroughness. We worked. We swept and cleared and opened windows to let the cold air move through and take the closed staleness with it. We did it mostly in silence, Sully and I, not the heavy silence of the morning, but a working silence, the kind that forms between two people who are doing something together and understand each other well enough not to need words for it. We moved around each other without colliding. We found a rhythm. Outside, the January light moved across the gray river, slow and indirect. After an hour, Sully called my name from the back of the cabin. "Ellie, come look at this." He was kneeling on the floor near the back wall. He had moved an old, moth-eaten rug aside, and beneath it the floorboards were exposed. And one of those boards was different from the others, shorter than it should have been, cut at an angle, inconsistent with the surrounding planks, positioned as though designed to be lifted rather than to stay. I knelt beside him. We worked our fingers into the edge together. The board resisted, swollen with years of cold and damp, seized in place by the same long patience that had sealed everything else in this boat. Then all at once it came loose with a sound like something finally yielding. Beneath it, a metal box, not large, about the size of a shoebox, built of heavier gauge metal than that comparison suggests, with fitted corners and a latch sealed shut by the rust of years. But intact. The corrosion had done what a padlock couldn't, seal the thing against time, against water, against whatever the world had thrown at the floor of this cabin for the past 2 decades. Sully looked at me. His eyes were asking the question. "Open it," I said. I pulled out my pocket knife. The latch had fused into the closed position, and it took several minutes of careful work, working the blade into the joint at the seam, applying pressure, and backing off and applying it again, feeling through the metal for the point where resistance might give before something shifted. A sound that was not quite a click, more like the quiet resignation of something that had been holding on for a long time and had finally decided to let go. The lid came free. We both leaned in. Inside the box there were two things. The first was a map, hand-drawn in pencil on paper, that had yellowed and gone soft at the edges with age, but still legible, precise, in the way that only someone with technical training draws, with measurements marked and angles recorded, and nothing left to estimation. The map showed the riverbank, the dock, the houseboat at its mooring. And from the boat running north, a dotted line marked off in careful intervals, ending at a point marked with a small cross and a handwritten notation beside it. Every line deliberate, every measurement exact. The second thing was an envelope, sealed, edged to the color of old cream. On the front, in handwriting that was deliberate, but showed the slight hesitation of hands that were no longer entirely steady, a single line to whoever finds this: "Please read." I looked at Sully. He looked at me. Neither of us said anything. I opened the envelope. The letter was 3 pages. The handwriting was careful. The letters formed with patience, the lines kept straight across the unlined paper. But there was a quality to it that told you the person writing had taken their time, not because the physical act was difficult, but because the words themselves were. Because they were words that had cost something to write. To whoever finds this letter, if you are reading these words, then you have found the boat. You have come aboard. You have looked the way people who are looking for something always look, at the floor where things are hidden. You have opened the box. I am grateful. I have been waiting for you for a long time. My name is Cord Mallory. I served in the United States Navy for 22 years. I served in Korea in the early part of the war, when the cold over there was a different kind of cold than Nebraska cold, but cold all the same, and I learned things about endurance and preparation that most people never have occasion to learn. When I came home, I wanted one thing. I wanted peace. I wanted a place where I could be alone with my thoughts and my memories and the ghosts that followed me home from the Yellow Sea, as ghosts from wars always follow men home, whether they're invited or not. I found that place here, on this river, on this boat. But peace was not what I was meant to have. In the fall of 1967, the worst flooding this part of Nebraska had seen since before my father's time swept through this valley. It came in the night, the way bad things often do, quickly and without warning, and with no mercy, and with a particular appetite for the things that cannot run. I watched the water rise. I watched the houses along the low bank go under one at a time, the lights in their windows going out like candles in a room someone was leaving for good. I watched people who had built their entire lives on this ground lose everything in the span of a few hours. And I watched my wife go into the water, and my daughter went with her. Their names were Sarah and Luella. Sarah was 41 years old. Luella was 6. She had red hair, my Luella, the kind of red that catches light the way fire catches light, burning bright even in the gray of a November afternoon. She had freckles across her nose and a smile that seemed to generate its own warmth, as though she carried something inside her that had nothing to do with the weather around her and everything to do with who she was. I went into the water after them. I want you to know that. I want you to understand that I tried. The flood current at that bend in the river, at the peak of that storm, was a thing alive, fast and strong, and completely indifferent to everything it was carrying. I went in and I could not find them, and the current took me somewhere else, and I came out of the water alone on a bank a half-mile downstream, and I have been alone in the particular way that only the survivors of such things are ever alone since that night. For a long time, I didn't know what to do with being alive. Survival felt like an accident, and sometimes it felt like a punishment, which is different from an accident. I had come home from a war. I had survived things that killed other men. And then I had failed on a flooded river in the county where I had lived my whole life to save a woman I loved and a 6-year-old girl with red hair on a night when I was right there, and it still wasn't enough. But I kept not dying, and after a while I stopped waiting for that to change and started considering what living might actually be for. The flood will come again. That is the thing that living on a river teaches you if you are willing to learn it. Not the farmers who have been here for generations and know the river's rhythms they know. I mean the people who build in the floodplain and expect the river to stay in its banks because it has so far, because the last serious flood was before their time and therefore outside their sense of what is possible. The river does not make permanent promises. The flood comes on a schedule that is longer than a human lifetime, long enough that people forget to be afraid between the times it happens. I decided to be ready. I am not a young man as I write this. My hands are not steady the way they used to be. The work goes more slowly than it did. There are mornings when I look at what still needs doing and I am not entirely certain I will finish it before I run out of time. But the shelter is finished. Everything I could build and stock and prepare is in place. Nearly 20 years of work hidden beneath the ground, 40 paces north of this boat, waiting for the moment when it will be needed. I won't be the one who uses it. I have no family left to protect. I am old and I am tired, and the only thing I want is to have done enough. But you are here. You found this box. You have read this far. Follow the map. Walk 40 paces north from the front of this boat. You will find a door set into the earth. Everything you will need is behind that door. It was built for people who have nowhere else to go. It was built for survivors. It was built for whoever God sends here when the water rises again. I could not save my family. Maybe you can save others. That is my hope. That is my prayer. That is the only thing I have left to give. God bless you, Captain Cord Mallory, December 1984. I read the letter twice, then a third time holding the pages carefully in my cold hands, making sure I had understood every word, every line. Then I handed it to Sully. I watched his face while he read. He read the way he always read, slowly, deliberately, giving each line its full weight. When he reached the part about Sarah and Luella, his jaw tightened. When he reached the end, he held the pages for a long moment without saying anything, looking at the last lines as though he was still moving through them. Then he looked up at me. He lost his family, Sully said. His voice was quiet the way voices get when they're trying to carry something that's heavier than they expected. And then he spent the rest of his life making sure it didn't happen to anyone else. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the letter hadn't already said better than I could. Sully set the pages down gently on the dusty floor between us. He picked up the map, studied it with the careful attention he gave to everything drawn, the lines, the measurements, the angles, the dotted path running north from the boat's prow to the cross marked at 40 paces. 40 paces north, he said. 40 paces north, I agreed. We got our coats. I found the small flashlight I had packed at the bottom of my bag, solid, reliable, with fresh batteries I had put in before we left Guard's house. Some practical instinct having prepared me without my knowing what it was preparing me for. We went out through the cabin door and across the deck and down the gangway to the dock. The January air received us the way it always did, flat and immediate, and without any interest in our circumstances. I stood at the front of the boat. I looked north. The land beyond the dock was flat and frozen dead grass and old snow, and the featureless gray-white of a Nebraska winter landscape that keeps none of its secrets on the surface. Nothing out there that looked like anything, nothing that looked like it was hiding 20 years of preparation beneath it. I began to walk. 1, 2, 3. I counted my steps out loud, keeping them even and measured. Sully walked beside me with the map open in both hands, checking the dotted line against the ground. 5, 6, 7. The frozen ground was hard underfoot, solid as concrete, the grass crunching under each step. I counted steadily. 15, 20, 25. Nothing had changed. It looked like it would go on, looking like nothing for as long as we were willing to walk across it. 30, 35, 37, 38, 39, 40. I stopped. I looked down. Dead grass, frozen earth, a patch of old snow that had crusted over and refrozen. Nothing that distinguished this exact spot from any other 10 feet of frozen ground in any direction. I shifted my foot and kicked lightly at the surface. My boot connected and the frozen ground returned the expected sound, a dull, dense thud. Frozen soil several inches deep, solid and unremarkable. I moved my foot slightly to the left and kicked again. The sound was different. Not the thud of frozen earth. A different register. A sound that had metal in it, that had hollow space beneath it, that said to anyone willing to listen to what ground sounds like, when it has something underneath it, that this was a surface, not a solid, that something had been put here on purpose. Sully heard it. He looked up from the map. We knelt down together. We started clearing with our hands, pulling dead grass aside, scraping at frozen debris, working through the accumulated years of surface material with our bare fingers in the January cold. The cold bit immediately and kept biting, working at our fingertips, but we kept going. Layer by layer, the dead grass, the ice, the compacted material beneath it. And slowly under our hands a shape emerged. A door, set into the earth at a slight angle nearly flush with the surface. Steel heavy gauge riveted, built to hold against anything the ground could put against it from above for as long as necessary. Rusted at the seams, yes. Filmed with years of exposure to cold and moisture, the iron-orange patina of metal that has been in contact with wet earth for a long time. But intact. The hinges were set deep into a concrete frame that was clearly still sound. And recessed into one edge, a handle, a heavy iron bar, U-shaped, designed for a two-handed grip. We looked at each other. I gripped the handle with both hands. I set my feet against the frozen ground for the purchase, and I pulled. The door resisted. It had been sealed not by any lock, but by years of rust and frozen earth and the simple weight of time bearing down on it from above. I pulled with everything I had, the cold in my hands, the $17 in my pocket, the weight of the letter I had just read, the 47 years of a man's life that had ended 5 years ago, with everything prepared and nobody yet arrived to use it. The door groaned, shifted, a sound like something that has been sealed against itself for a very long time, finally beginning to give. And then inch by inch it opened. A rush of air came up from the darkness below. Not the aggressive cutting cold of the January air above, something different, something steady and deep. The temperature of the earth at depth, the temperature that doesn't shift with the seasons, that holds regardless of what the sky is doing 20 feet above it. Cool and dry and absolutely still. My flashlight found the ladder. Steel rungs bolted into a concrete wall, descending into darkness and that the beam didn't reach the bottom of. I looked at Sully. He was looking at the open door at the darkness below, at the ladder going down into whatever Captain Cord Mallory had spent 20 years of his life preparing for a person he would never meet. I held the letter in one hand. I looked at the last line I had read 3 times. The mission is yours now. I put my foot on the first rung. I took one breath of that old, cool air rising from the dark, and I climbed down. The bottom of the ladder was concrete. I felt it under my boots before the flashlight beam reached it, solid level, the kind of surface that had been poured with intention and allowed to cure completely before anyone walked on it. I stepped off the last rung and turned around in the darkness, and I raised the flashlight. The beam traveled across the space and did not immediately find a wall to stop it. I stood there for a moment, letting the light move, letting my eyes adjust to what it was showing me. Behind me, Sully's boots found the concrete, and he stepped off the ladder and stood beside me, and I heard the small sound he made, not a word. Not a complete exhale, something partway between the two. The sound a person makes when the thing in front of them is substantially different from anything they had been prepared to find. This was not a hole in the ground. This was a room. Concrete walls poured in sections with seams between them that had been filled and sealed. A ceiling of the same material reinforced with steel beams running the width of the space at regular intervals bolted into the walls at each end with the kind of hardware that is rated for load-bearing and not merely decorative. The floor was level and dry. The air was that same deep constant temperature I had felt at the top of the ladder, not warm, not cold, just fixed. The temperature the earth keeps when you go deep enough, the temperature that doesn't negotiate with seasons. The flashlight beam traveled down the length of the room an estimated 50 feet before it hit the far wall. Along both side walls from floor to ceiling shelving. Not improvised shelving, not the plywood and bracket construction of someone who needed somewhere to put things. Real shelving built from angle iron and treated lumber bolted into the concrete walls at regular intervals level, and true, designed to hold weight over the long term. And on every shelf things, organized things, labeled things, we walked deeper into the space. The shelving on the left wall held food. Canned goods in rows, not random accumulation, but systematic variety of vegetables, protein, fruit, soup, beans. The full range of what a person or a group of people would need to sustain themselves for an extended period without access to anything outside. Every can was labeled in a handwriting. I now recognize the careful, slightly unsteady script of a man who knew his hands were getting slower and was compensating with deliberateness. The labels noted not just contents, but dates, the year each item had been rotated in the year it should be replaced. Some of the dates were old enough that the food would need to be restocked. But the organization remained. The system remained. The shelving on the right wall held equipment and supplies. Water containers, heavy-duty plastic, sealed, stacked in careful columns with the same rotation dating system. Medical kits in green canvas cases, each one sealed and labeled by the date of its last restocking, equipped with the kind of thorough competence that suggested the person who assembled them had known at some point what it actually meant to need medical supplies and not have them. Blankets sealed in plastic, compressed flat, and stacked with rope, binding them at regular intervals. Tools carefully oiled and wrapped, sorted by type and function, and stored in wooden cases with fitted interiors where each item sat in a space shaped exactly for it. Batteries in sealed containers. Lanterns. A portable generator clean and maintained with additional fuel canisters stored at a distance from it in a ventilated section of the far wall. And in the far corner built against the back wall, a desk, metal with a surface lamp on it that ran off its own battery, a small thing designed to sit for years and still work when you needed it. A chair, a lamp that had gone dead with time but had been there when it mattered. A stack of notebooks squared up against the left side of the desk with the precise squareness of a man who kept things orderly because order in the space around him was the thing he could still control. I sat down at the desk. I opened the first notebook. It was a journal. Cord Mallory's handwriting filled it from the first page to close to the last dates at the top of each entry, the entries themselves running from short, a single paragraph, sometimes less a note about what had been done or purchased or installed, to longer ones, where the handwriting changed in a way that had nothing to do with his hands and everything to do with what he was trying to say. I turned to the first entry. November 14th, 1967. The flood came 3 days ago. The water is finally receding. I have been searching the riverbank every day since it happened. I have not found them. I don't know if I ever will. The current at peak was running at speeds I hadn't seen since the spring floods of my childhood, and those were bad enough that my father talked about them for the rest of his life. Sarah was 41 years old. Luella was 6. They were my entire world, and they are gone, and I am sitting in this boat, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do next. I should have died with them. I have thought about this carefully, and I think it would have been better if I had. But I didn't, and here I am, and apparently I have to figure out what that means. I kept reading. Sully was moving slowly along the shelving, running his hand along the edge of each section, not touching anything, just moving through the space the way you move through a place you're trying to understand. His flashlight tracked with him. The sketchbook was in his other hand. He had pulled it out at some point without my noticing, and he was holding it at his side with the absent grip of someone who doesn't realize they're carrying it. March 3rd, 1968. I have begun digging. I don't know exactly what I'm building yet. I know it needs to be strong and it needs to be underground and it needs to be capable of sheltering people who have nowhere else to go when the water comes again. The water will come again. I believe this the way I believe in gravity. It is a fact about how the world operates, and only the people who have been lucky enough not to experience it yet are surprised when it happens. My neighbor Elkins came by today and asked what I was doing. I told him I was putting in a root cellar. He nodded and went away satisfied, which tells you something about how much people want to look closely at things that don't concern them directly. June 22nd, 1975. 8 years of work. The main structure is complete concrete walls, steel reinforced ceiling, the door is in and sealed. The ventilation system is working as designed. I have begun stocking. First priority, water storage, then food, then medical supplies. The county library has been helpful. I have been reading everything I can find about disaster preparedness, about the logistics of sheltering multiple people for extended periods, about what gets people killed in floods, and what keeps them alive. I think I can accommodate 20 people, possibly more if they're not worried about comfort. Comfort is negotiable. Living is not. The people in town have opinions about what I'm doing. I can see it in the way they talk around me at the hardware store, the particular silence that forms when I carry materials down to the boat. They think I've gone strange with grief. Maybe I have, but the shelter is being built either way. Sully had come to stand behind me. He was reading over my shoulder the way he always read over my shoulder when something was worth reading, leaning in slightly without asking permission, because he knew I didn't mind. December 1st, 1984. My hands shake more than they used to. I cannot move the heavy materials alone anymore, and I have had to accept this and work around it. But the shelter is complete, fully stocked, fully prepared, equipped for everything I know how to anticipate. I have written a letter and sealed it in the boat where someone who is looking will find it. I have done everything I can do. The rest belongs to whoever comes after. The last entry was dated December 1st, 1984. After it, the pages were blank. I closed the notebook carefully and set it back on the desk. I sat for a moment in the deep, still quiet of the space. No wind in here, no river sound, no weather of any kind. Just the temperature the earth chose to keep, and the silence of a room that had been waiting for a long time. He spent his whole life building this, Sully said quietly, and then he died before anyone came. The way he said it was not an indictment. It was just the fact of the thing stated plainly with the weight it deserved. But we're here now, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, yeah. He looked around the room again, the shelving, the careful organization, the generator in the corner, the seams in the concrete walls where a man's years of work had been poured and set. We're here. I stood up from the desk. I walked back along the length of the shelter, looking at the shelves again, understanding now in a different way what I was looking at. This was not just food and water and blankets. This was a system designed by someone who had thought carefully about how people actually survive things that are trying to kill them. What they need in what order. What runs out first. What matters most when everything is on the line. Captain Cord Mallory had given us more than a houseboat. He had given us this. He had given us the thing we needed most and didn't know we needed a reason that went beyond ourselves. A purpose that was bigger than the $47 in my coat pocket and the 72-hour deadline, and the question of whether two teenagers could prove to a county sheriff that they were something other than a case file waiting to be processed. He had given us something to be for. The next 2 weeks were the hardest work of my life. Every day we rose before the light came fully into the sky, and we worked until the light was gone. The houseboat was in better structural shape than it appeared from the outside. The frame Mallory had built was solid and had resisted the years better than the surface showed, but there was significant work to do, and we did it with the materials available to us, which meant we were creative in ways that would not have survived inspection by anyone with formal standards. We patched the roof sections that had sagged using lumber salvaged from a collapsed hay barn, a mile down the county road, whose owner was a man named Ketterman, a 70-year-old farmer who had no use for the fallen structure and told us to take whatever we could carry. We replaced the cracked window glass with storm plastic sheeting, which was not glass but held the cold out well enough. We cleaned the potbelly stove and tested the flue and found that Mallory had maintained it well. It drew clean and held heat with the reliable stubbornness of good cast iron properly maintained. The water in the shelter needed rotation. We brought up the oldest containers, refilled them from the town pump, and carried them back down. The food was checked against the dates Mallory had left, most of it still within acceptable range, some of it past and needing replacement. We replaced what we could afford to replace. Gradually, methodically following the logic of the system Mallory had designed, we brought it back to readiness. Sully worked without complaint. Sully worked with the kind of focus that I had come to understand was his natural state when he had something real to do. The same focus he brought to the sketchbook transferred now to physical labor, his hands learning the new vocabulary of boards and nails and iron fittings and rope. He was good at it, better than I expected. He made fewer mistakes than I did, made them less often, and when he did, he identified them immediately and corrected them without anything needing to be said. At night, he drew. He drew the boat from outside from multiple angles with the dimensional precision of someone thinking about structures rather than just pictures. He drew the bunker layout carefully to scale with the shelving marked in the generator position noted and the ventilation path annotated in his small, neat handwriting. He drew designs I couldn't identify at first, plans for things that didn't yet exist, modifications and expansions and additions that existed only in the part of his brain that was already thinking several steps beyond where we currently were. I didn't ask him about the drawings. I let them be what they were. Sometimes you understand something better if you don't name it. On the third day, a truck appeared at the end of the landing road. I was on the deck when it pulled up, caulking one of the seams along the starboard side where the wood had dried and cracked and let in cold air. I straightened and watched the truck come to a stop and a woman get out. She was small and compact in the way of someone who had been built that way from the start, not reduced by age, but shaped by it into something more concentrated, more efficient. Gray hair cut short and practical. Sharp eyes that took in the boat, the dock me on the deck with my caulking tool, Sully's work coat draped over the railing, all of it in the direct and unapologetic way of a person who sees what's in front of her and forms her own judgment about it without asking permission. She was carrying a cardboard box. She walked down to the dock with a steady step that did not hurry and did not slow down to account for the ice on the boards. She set the box down at the end of the dock and looked up at me. "You're the ward girl," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Ruth Garner. I have the property a quarter-mile east." She looked at the box beside her. "Brought you things. Food mostly. Some soap. 2 candles. Nothing to brag about, but it'll see you through a few days." She paused. "I figured you could use it." I came down the gangway. I hadn't been given things, not in the straightforward way this woman was giving them, without ceremony or condition, or the slight additional weight of obligation that comes with charity. I didn't know what to do with it. "We don't have a way to pay you back," I said. She made a gesture with one hand that dismissed the idea before it had fully formed. "Didn't ask you to." She was looking at the boat now with the kind of focused attention that looks beyond the surface to something else, something she recognized. "This was Cord Mallory's boat," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes, ma'am, we bought it at Town Hall. Title transferred 2 days ago." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "Doris told me." A pause. "I was in town for the mail." The way she said it, quietly without elaboration, made me understand that she had already known before she came out here. She had come out here knowing, and the box of food was connected to what she knew, not a coincidence. "You knew him," I said. She looked at me directly. Something moved behind her eyes, the specific kind of movement that happens when a person is deciding how much of something real they are willing to offer to someone they don't know yet. "In 1967, she said, I was 24 years old. I was working the night shift at the county agricultural office down on the low side of town. When the flood came, it came fast enough that I didn't have the time to do much except get on top of the largest desk I could find. The water came through the windows." She paused. "Cord Mallory came through the door about 15 minutes later. He was wading chest deep, moving against a current that would have taken most men off their feet. He pulled me out. He got me to high ground and then he went back. She stopped speaking for a moment. He went back into that water 6 more times that night, she said. I know because I stood on the high ground and I counted. I thought about the journal entry. March 3rd, 1968. The people in town think I've gone strange with grief. Let them think what they want. He saved 18 people that night, Ruth said. Could have been more. Would have been more probably, except that the water took Sarah and Luella while he was out there saving the rest of them. He found out when he came back. She said this flatly without dramatizing it, which made it worse. He never talked about it much after. He just stayed on that boat and worked on whatever it was he was working on, and people in town decided that meant he was strange and they let him be. She looked at me with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her gaze came to my hair and stayed there for a moment, and something passed across her face that I couldn't read, a recognition or the edge of one, a thought that arrived and was set aside. She looked away. Anyway, she said, you need anything, you come to me. He was a good man, and I don't intend to let what he built go to waste. She turned and walked back to her truck with the same steady, unhurried stride she had arrived with. Mrs. Garner, I called after her. She stopped, turned. Why are you doing this, really? She held me in her gaze for a moment. Then she said something I didn't fully understand at the time, though it became clearer later. Because some things work out the way they were supposed to, she said, even when it takes a while. She drove away. Sully appeared at my shoulder. Who was that? I looked at the box of food on the dock, the soup cans, the wrapped soap, the 2 plain white candles. A neighbor, I said. We have a neighbor. Sheriff Bowen came on the 4th day. He did not knock. He walked down the dock and climbed aboard with the authority of his office and the matter-of-fact practicality of a man who has learned over 20 years in law enforcement and that the people who deserve respect will still have it when he's done, and the ones who don't never had it to begin with. He moved through the cabin, slowly looking. Not intruding, nothing was touched, nothing was opened, but observing the way a person observes when they are building a picture in their head and want to make sure it's accurate. He checked the stove. He looked at the patched roof sections. He noted the supplies, the food on the counter, the blankets folded on the bunks we had made from the built-in frames, the repaired windows with their plastic sheeting, keeping the cold out. He looked at everything with the same methodical patience he had shown on the street outside the diner, giving each thing its due without rushing toward a conclusion. When he was done, he stood on the deck and looked at the river for a long time. I've seen a lot of kids come through this county, he said finally. His voice had lost some of its official register. Not soft exactly, but different. The voice of someone speaking as themselves rather than as a position. Most of them end up in the system eventually. Group homes, short-term placements with families who mean well and can't always follow through. It breaks them a lot of the time. Not all of them, but a lot. He turned to look at me. You're different, he said. Both of you. I didn't say anything. I don't know your whole story. I know pieces of it. I know Gar Durbin has had complaints filed against him that didn't go anywhere because he was careful enough not to leave marks and clever enough to always have an alternative explanation. Something in his jaw tightened briefly. I know your mother was a decent woman who made a bad choice because she was dealing with things that would have broken most people, and that's not a judgment, that's a fact. He paused. Whatever you two have, whatever it is that got you here and keeps you working on this boat at 6 in the morning, that's worth something. That's worth protecting. He put his notebook away. I'm not making any calls, not today. I'll be checking back. Yes, sir. He nodded once, the way a man nods when words have been spoken that don't require a response because the thing that mattered was the saying of them. Then he walked back up the dock and drove away. Sully was standing in the cabin doorway. He had heard all of it. Grit, he said. What? That's what he said before. On the street in town, he said we had grit. I thought about this, about what grit actually was, whether it was something you had or something that happened to you when you didn't have anything else, whether there was a meaningful difference between those two things. Maybe, I said. Sully looked at the river for a moment. Then he went back inside and picked up his pencil and started drawing. The 15th day I was in the shelter. I had come down in the morning to check the ventilation system. Mallory's design was sound, but the intake filter needed clearing, something that needed to be done periodically to keep the air moving correctly. I was working at the far end, standing on the lowest shelf to reach the filter housing in the ceiling, when I heard footsteps on the dock above. Heavy ones. Not Sully's gait, not Ruth Garner's measured tread. I came up out of the shelter and found a man standing on the dock. He was in his mid-20s, lean in the narrow way of someone who had been through something physical that had taken weight off him and not yet put it back. Dark hair worn short, dark eyes that had the particular quality of eyes that have learned to take inventory of a room before deciding whether to relax in it. He was dressed for the cold, but not for weather like this, a coat that wasn't quite enough, boots that were more city than country. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, looking at the houseboat with an expression I couldn't read from the gangway. He heard me coming and turned around. Something shifted in his face when he saw me, a small movement of recognition as though I matched something he had been told to expect. "Ellie Ward," he said. It wasn't a question the way the sheriff's had been that measured official certainty. This was different. This was the voice of someone who had prepared for this conversation and was now executing it. "Who are you?" I asked. He reached into his coat, not threatening, deliberate. He produced an envelope and held it out between two fingers. Legal size, thick enough to hold multiple pages. "My name is Marcus Durbin," he said. "My father is Guard Durbin." The dock seemed to become slightly less steady under my feet, and I knew it was not the dock. He continued before I could speak in the measured paced cadence of someone who has rehearsed what they came to say and is executing the rehearsal. "Your mother had a life insurance policy. $15,000. The claim has been processing for 3 years and it cleared last week. The beneficiary on record is you, Ellie Ward." He paused. "But you're 17 years old. In Nebraska, a minor cannot control or access a financial settlement of this size without a legal guardian's authorization. And according to the state's records, your legal guardian is Guard Durbin." The cold was doing something it had not been doing a moment before, which was finding the gaps in my coat and reaching through them. "Guard Durbin threw us out," I said. "He abandoned us." "Did he file any paperwork reflecting that?" Marcus's voice was not unkind precisely, but it had no warmth in it either. It was the voice of someone delivering a message. They are being paid to deliver someone who has decided that their relationship to the content of the message is professional rather than personal. "Did he sign documents surrendering guardianship? Does the state have any record indicating that the legal relationship between Guard Durbin and you and your brother has been formally dissolved?" I said nothing. "The state has no such record," Marcus said, "which means Guard Durbin is, as of this moment, still your legal guardian of record. And as your legal guardian, he has the legal right to petition for control of a financial settlement made to a minor in his care." He held out the envelope. "There's a court date, 30 days from today." I looked at the envelope. I did not take it. He set it on the dock railing beside him. He also wanted me to point out, Marcus continued, his voice, the same level register, the same professional remove, that if a court becomes aware of 2 minors living alone without adult supervision, there are remedies available to the court that may not be to your preference. Foster care. The word didn't need to be spoken to be present. "Think about it," he said. "I'll be back." He walked up the dock and got into a car I hadn't noticed arriving, a vehicle that had been on the county road waiting for him, and he drove away. Sully had come up from below while Marcus was talking. He was standing behind my left shoulder, and when I turned, I could see his jaw set in the way it set when he was absorbing something and processing it into something he could act on. I picked up the envelope. We went inside. That night, we sat in the main cabin with the envelope between us and the potbelly stove working steadily in the corner, and the Missouri River making its quiet sounds against the hull. I read the court documents twice. Legal language dense and precise, the kind of language designed to be unambiguous and succeeds at that, while being nearly incomprehensible to anyone without training. But the core of it was what Marcus Durbin had stated plainly: 30 days. A hearing to determine legal guardianship and financial control of a $15,000 insurance settlement that belonged to me in every way that should matter, and in none of the ways that a court would care about if the proceeding went the wrong direction. $15,000. My mother had taken out the policy years before she got sick, when she still had the particular practical foresight of someone who understood that the world doesn't always arrange itself well for the people it leaves behind. She had named me as beneficiary. She had done the thing a mother does when she understands in some deep and quiet part of herself that she needs to make sure something survives her. She had done this while she was still healthy enough to do it before the cancer took that away from her too. And now that money was in the hands of a legal process that Guard Durbin had put in motion with a phone call and the assistance of a son I had never heard of before today. What do we do? Sully asked. I looked at the letter on the table beside the legal documents. Mallory's letter, which I had kept out of the metal box and carried with me since I first read it. I thought about the journal entries. I thought about a man who had been fighting quietly and without recognition against something that most people would have accepted as a permanent condition of their reality, who had simply decided that it wasn't acceptable and worked at it for 2 decades until it was ready. We fight, I said. We don't fold on this. We don't let them take what's ours. How come? I don't know yet, but 30 days is 30 days. We have time to figure it out. I wasn't entirely sure I believed this, but I knew with the certainty of someone who has run out of alternatives that not believing it wasn't an option. On the 22nd day, the sky changed. I noticed it early before the sun was fully up in the particular quality of the light coming through the windows wrong, in a way I had seen before and not been able to name until Ruth Garner's voice was in my memory, saying something about the way the weather looks before the bad kind comes. Not the flat steel gray of ordinary Nebraska winter. Something else. Yellow in it. The bruise color. The radio told me what it was. A winter storm system of exceptional severity, the announcer said, with the practiced calm of someone who has trained for the moment when the news requires precisely this kind of delivery. Moving in from the west with unusual speed. Projections suggesting the largest single event snowfall in the region since the early 60s, perhaps longer. Wind speeds that would create near zero visibility. Temperature drops in a range that would make exposed time dangerous within minutes. Governor had issued a state of emergency for a 12-county area. All non-essential travel suspended. I turned the radio off. I looked at Sully, who had been listening from the doorway of the cabin. His face was doing the thing it did when he was working something out, moving through the implications with the quiet thoroughness of someone who doesn't like to speak before he's finished thinking. The bunker, he said. The bunker, I said. We spent the next 12 hours preparing. This was what the shelter had been built for, exactly this, precisely this, the situation where there was nowhere else to go, and the thing you had prepared was all that stood between you and the weather's complete indifference. We brought up what we needed: blankets, generator fuel, the portable cooking equipment, medical kits positioned where they could be reached quickly. We checked the ventilation again. We checked the water supply. We checked everything that could be checked. The snow started that evening. Soft at first, the deceptive beginning, the version that makes you think it might not be as bad as the forecast said. But Mallory's journals had given me something I wouldn't have otherwise had: the understanding that things are often exactly as bad as they are going to be, and that the soft beginnings part of the weather's particular dishonesty. By midnight, the wind was a different entity entirely. It hit the boat in gusts that made the hull groan in ways I had never heard it groan, the sound of something being tested at the outer limit of its design parameters. The temperature outside dropped past anything my coat thermometer could register. The power for the county went out at 12:43, I know, because I watched the clock on the shelf go dark, and that simple absence was somehow more alarming than anything I had prepared for. I kept the stove hot. I kept the lights on. I kept the smoke coming from the flue. The first knock came just after noon the next day. I had been working in the cabin cataloging the food stores against what we had down in the shelter when the sound came through the wind, 3 deliberate strikes against the hull, not the random percussion of debris or weather, but the organized sound of a person who wants to be let in. I opened the door. A family. A man in his late 30s with ice in his beard and the particular controlled stillness of someone who is very cold and is using all available mental resources to remain functional. Beside him, a woman wrapped in a coat that had done everything a coat could do and was now exhausted from the effort. 3 children in a cluster between the adults, the oldest, maybe 8, pressed close together in the instinctive way children press together when the world has gotten very large and very serious around them. The man said, "Our car went off the road about a mile south. We saw your smoke." Behind me, the stove was burning. "Come in," I said. They came in. Their names, when they were warm enough to speak, were Conrad and Marta Falwell. Their children were called by names I learned later that night. They were just children, wet and cold, and close to the edge of the thing, where cold becomes something the body can no longer manage. We wrapped them in blankets. We heated soup from the shelter stores. We gave them the bunks and sat beside the stove and waited. More people came the next morning. A truck driver alone whose rig had gone sideways on the highway a quarter-mile north. Two college students, a brother and sister, 20 and 22, who had been hiking the river trail and been caught by the storm's speed. An elderly couple named Pressler, whose furnace had failed when the power went out and whose house was a half-mile away, but had become unreachable when the drifts made the road between here and there a different kind of road entirely. By the end of the third day, there were 15 people living in the houseboat and the shelter. By the fifth day, there were 22. The bunker became essential in the way that things designed for exactly a situation become essential when that situation arrives, not with drama, not with the moment of recognition you might expect, but quietly, practically, as the obvious answer to a problem that had been accumulating for days. We led people down the ladder. We showed them the shelves. We showed them the organization, the water, the generator that ran 4 hours a night, and made it possible to have light and to keep the critical equipment working. We showed them everything Cord Mallory had built and thought through and prepared for over 2 decades of quiet, unrecognized work. They stood in the shelter and they stared. "Who built this, man?" asked Conrad Falwell, who had a way of asking questions that expected real answers, not rhetorical, genuinely wanting to know. "A man named Cord Mallory," I said. "He died about 5 years ago. He spent nearly 20 years building this place." Why I thought about the journal. I thought about November 14th, 1967. I thought about a man standing on a high bank in a receding flood looking for people who were not there to be found. Because he lost people he loved, I said, and he never wanted anyone else to lose what he lost. The shelter held all of us. Not comfortably, 22 people in a space built for 20 means compromises, means rotation in the sleeping arrangements, means careful rationing of food and fuel, and the patience required to live in close quarters with strangers when everyone is frightened and tired, and the storm outside has been going on for long enough that the concept of the storm ending has started to feel theoretical. But it held. Everything Mallory had built and stocked and maintained and thought through held exactly as it was designed to hold. Sully managed the generator schedule. He had intuited within the first day the precise intervals that maximized the benefit of the fuel supply, 4 hours on long stretch off time to the periods when cooking and warming and the maintenance of critical equipment were most necessary. He did this without being asked, without announcing it, simply observed what was needed and built a system for providing it. The children gravitated to him in the way that children gravitate to people who are calm and competent and give them the impression that the situation is understood and being managed. He drew them pictures, not great drawings, not the technical diagrams he made in his sketchbook for himself. Simple things, animals' funny faces, the outline of the boat from above, with the shelter drawn beneath it, connected by the ladder shaft, a cross-section that made the children say, "Oh," and lean in close to see. He drew them the river, the way it would look in summer when the ice was gone and the water was warm enough to swim in, and they held those pictures in their hands with the concentration of people looking at something they need to believe in. On the 7th night, someone knocked on the door again. I was in the shelter at the far end, checking the water rotation when I heard the sound come through the ceiling, the particular pattern that had become recognizable over the days. 3 deliberate knocks against the hull above the sound of a person asking permission. I climbed the ladder. I came up through the floor of the cabin. I crossed to the door. I opened it. The cold outside was at a depth I could feel immediately in my lungs, the kind of cold that has nothing gentle in it. Wind-driven snow hit my face, and I squinted against it, looking for whoever had knocked. He was at the edge of the dock. He had made it as far as the dock railing, which he was holding with both hands, in the grip of someone who is not sure their legs will continue to hold them without assistance. He was in bad shape. I could see this at a distance in the way he was holding himself. The tight, effortful stillness of someone who has been cold for a very long time and is using everything remaining to stay upright and functional. Ice in his hair, ice in his eyebrows. His lips had a color they should not have had. Even in that condition, in that light, I recognized him. Marcus Durbin. I stood in the doorway for a moment. The wind came through and the cold came with it, and behind me in the shelter, 22 people were staying alive because of what was in this boat and in the ground beneath it. And the man on the dock railing had come here 30 days ago with a legal envelope and the plan to take everything we had. I heard Sully come up the ladder behind me. He looked past my shoulder at the man on the dock. "Send him away," Sully said. His voice was flat and quiet the way a voice gets when it has decided something and doesn't want to be argued with. Marcus Durbin heard this. Or maybe he just saw my hesitation, which was the same thing. He looked at me across the dock in the wind-driven snow, and his eyes had lost the professional remove they had carried the last time I saw them. There was nothing professional in them now. There was nothing calculated. There was just a person looking at a door and understanding with perfect clarity what it meant. "Please," he said. The word came out stripped of everything else, just the word itself, nothing around it. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." I thought about what Cord Mallory had written. I thought about a man who went into floodwater 6 times to save people he didn't know, while his own world was ending. I thought about 22 people in the shelter below me, including children who had been too cold to cry and were now warm enough to sleep. I thought about the mission. I stepped aside. "Come in," I said. Sully's hand found my arm. His grip was tight with something that was not approval. "Josie," he started. "I know who he is," I said quietly, "and I know what he did, but I'm not going to let someone die bound on this dock." I held his gaze. "That's not who we are, Sully. That's not what this place is for." He looked at me for a long moment with the tight jaw and the eyes that were doing something complicated. Then slowly his hand dropped from my arm. Marcus Durbin stumbled inside. We wrapped him in blankets. We gave him hot water from the pot on the stove, made him hold the cup with both hands until the shaking began to ease. We put him by the fire. He didn't speak. He sat there with the blanket around his shoulders and his hands around the cup, staring at the floor of the cabin with the expression of someone who has been stripped down to something they weren't ready to look at. The other survivors watched in silence. They didn't know who he was or what he had done, but something had shifted in the room when I opened that door, and they felt it the way you feel a change in pressure, the sense that something important had just been decided. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, the shelter held. Both of these things were equally true, equally real, part of the night that Cord Mallory had spent 20 years preparing for not just the survival of the people beneath the ground, but the particular human difficulty of choosing when everything is at its worst, and the cold is pressing in from all sides to open the door anyway. I went back down the ladder. The generator was running. The water was accounted for. The food was adequate for at least 4 more days, and the storm had to end before then, because storms always ended. I sat at Mallory's desk in the deep quiet of the shelter, and I opened his first journal to the beginning, and I started to read from page 1, beginning to end, the story of how a man decided what to do with the time he had left after everything he loved was gone. Above me, the wind kept working at the boat. The whole absorbed it the way it had always absorbed it, with the patient solidity of something built to hold. The storm ended on the 10th day. It did not end dramatically. There was no single moment when the wind stopped or the snow ceased or the sky declared itself finished. It tapered. The gusts came less frequently, then less hard, then with less conviction behind them, the way an argument loses force when the person making it has run out of new things to say. The snow thinned from a wall to a curtain to a veil, and then to scattered flakes that fell without urgency through air that was still very cold but had lost its appetite for destruction. And then on the morning of the 11th day, the sun came out. I was standing on the deck when it happened. I had come up just before first light to check the flue, which had been doing something in the night, a minor obstruction in the intake that needed clearing, and I was standing in the cold with my hands in my coat pockets when the sky in the east began to change color. First the gray lightened, then it went pale gold. Then the sun came over the flat horizon line and hit the snow-covered landscape, and the light that came back was extraordinary. The particular brilliance of winter sun on fresh snow that is so intense it is almost painful. The world made white and reflective and absolutely still in the aftermath of everything it had just been through. I stood there for a long time and looked at it. After a while, I heard movement from below, the sounds of people waking, the particular shuffle of 22 people in a confined space, beginning the slow process of returning to the version of themselves that existed before a 10-day storm had reduced everything to the essentials. Voices. the smell of coffee from the camp stove we had been running on rationed fuel, the sound of children who had been contained for 10 days beginning to understand that containment was ending. The survivors emerged over the course of that morning and the afternoon that followed. They came up from the shelter and they came through the cabin door and they stood on the deck and they looked at the changed world with the expression of people who have been through something that has permanently rearranged their understanding of what they are capable of surviving. Some of them cried. Some of them simply stood very still and breathed the cold, clean air with the careful attention of people who have recently been reminded that breathing is not to be taken for granted. Rescue vehicles came by early afternoon. National Guard trucks moving slowly through drifts that in places reached to their hoods, and behind them, county emergency vehicles and ambulances and the various machinery that mobilizes when a region has been through something large enough to require the machinery. They had been trying to reach us for days, blocked by roads that the storm had made into something other than roads. Now finally the roads were passable enough. One by one the people Sully and I had sheltered through those 10 days left. They left with the particular warmth of people who have been saved by specific individuals and know it not the abstract gratitude of someone helped by a system or a category of helpers, but the direct personal warmth of people who can point to exact moments and exact actions and exact faces and say that person, that choice, that is why I am here. They pressed our hands. They held on slightly too long. They said things they meant entirely in voices that had not fully recovered their ordinary register. Conrad Falwell was one of the last to go. He stood on the dock with his wife and his 3 children behind him, and he looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. "You saved my family," he said. His voice had the quality of a statement that has been prepared, carefully held, and is now being offered as something real. "My children are alive because of what's in this boat and in this ground." "It wasn't only us," I said. "It was Mallory. Everything he built, everything he prepared." Conrad nodded slowly. He looked at the houseboat at the dock at the flat white field beyond the dock's end, where a door set into the earth was now once again barely distinguishable from the surrounding ground. He held all of it in his gaze for a moment. "Then I'll thank him too," he said. "Every day I have left." He shook my hand. He hugged Sully, who accepted it with the slightly stiff posture of someone not entirely accustomed to being embraced by strangers, but understanding the necessity. Then Conrad Falwell lifted his youngest child onto his hip and walked up the dock to the rescue truck. I watched them go. I watched until the truck disappeared around the bend in the county road. Then I turned around and went to figure out what came next. Marcus Durbin did not leave with the others. He had spent the 10 days of the storm in the shelter in the corner farthest from everyone else. He ate when food was offered and slept when sleep was possible, and otherwise occupied himself with a silence that was different from the professional remove he had arrived with. That silence had been a choice, a posture, something worn deliberately. This one was different. This was the silence of someone who has had something taken from them, not by another person, but by a situation, and is sitting with the absence of it. On the 3rd day, I had gone down to the shelter in the middle of the night for water and found him at Mallory's desk. The journal was open in front of him. Not the first journal, the second one, the later entries, the ones where the handwriting showed the slowing of the years and the pages were longer and the language had lost some of its brevity and taken on instead the quality of a man who had decided that precision mattered more than efficiency. He didn't hear me come down the ladder. He was reading with the total focus of someone who has found something they weren't looking for, but needed badly, the way you find something in a library by accident that answers a question you had stopped asking because you believed it was unanswerable. I got my water and went back up without disturbing him. He came to find me after the storm ended, when the last of the survivors had gone and the dock was quiet, and Sully was below doing the first post-storm inventory of the shelter supplies. He found me on the deck doing nothing in particular, which was a condition I had not been in for 10 days and was adjusting to with difficulty. He stood at the far end of the deck for a moment, his hands in his pockets, looking at the river. Then he walked over and stood beside me. He was quiet for a long time. I let the quiet be what it was. "That man," he said finally. "Mallory, in the journal. Yes. He lost everything. It was not a question. Yes. And then he spent 20 years building something for strangers he would never meet." Marcus stopped. The river moved below us, the ice at the edges beginning to give fractionally under the influence of the sun, the first tentative signals of what would eventually become spring. Not because it fixed anything, not because it brought them back, just because it was the thing left to do. I didn't say anything. The river said something quietly in the language rivers speak. "I need to tell you something," Marcus said. He turned to face me. His eyes had lost the last of whatever professional coating had been on them when he arrived. What was underneath was ordinary enough, a man in his 20s who had done something he was now required to live with and was finding that living with it cost more than he had budgeted for. "Your mother came to see me in prison," he said. The river went quiet. "About 6 months before she died. I didn't know who she was at first. She came during a visiting period, signed in as a family friend, which was what she told the intake officer. I thought she was one of the volunteer visitors the church sent sometimes, but she said she was Ellie Ward's mother, and I didn't know what to do with that." He reached into his coat. He produced something small and worn, a photograph creased along the fold lines in the way of something carried for a long time in a pocket not designed for photographs. He held it out. I took it. The photograph showed a woman. Middle-aged, thin in the way that illness makes a person thin, the particular thinness that goes deeper than weight and involves something structural. Red hair going gray at the temples. Eyes that were tired in a way that sleep hadn't touched in a long time. And a smile that had clearly cost her something to produce and that she had produced anyway for whoever was holding the camera because she had decided the smile was worth the cost. My mother's face looked back at me from a photograph I had never seen before. She was in a room I recognized from the configuration of the furniture and the institutional quality of the light, a prison visiting room. She was sitting across a table from someone who was not in the frame. I held the photograph. "She said she'd heard about me from your father," Marcus continued, "from Guard. He'd mentioned me, his son, from his first marriage, the one who had gotten into trouble. She said she wanted to see if I was all right." He said this with the slight hesitation of someone who is still years later not entirely able to account for the reality of the thing they are describing. The particular disorientation of a kindness that arrived from an unexpected direction. "Why?" I asked. My voice sounded different to me than it usually did. Somewhere lower, somewhere more careful. I asked her the same thing. He looked at the river. "She said that everyone deserves someone who cares whether they live or die. That she had heard I didn't have much of that, and she thought that was wrong." He paused. "I told her it wasn't her responsibility. She said responsibility didn't have much to do with it." I thought about my mother in a hospital bed. I thought about what the months before that were like, the slow loss of weight, the slow loss of strength, the way she had continued to organize herself around other people's needs, even when she barely had enough energy for her own. I had thought I understood her by then. I thought I knew the size of her. I had underestimated. "She wrote to me," Marcus said. "Every month, after the visit, she started writing. Letters about you and Sully, what you were doing in school, how Sully drew things, how you were learning to manage everything that needed managing. She wrote about what she hoped for you, small things, that you'd have a home eventually, that Sully would get to use whatever it was he had in his hands." He stopped. When the letter stopped coming, I knew. I didn't know the exact date, but I knew. I looked at the photograph in my hands. My mother's smile in a prison visiting room aimed at a young man she owed nothing and chose to show up for anyway. "Before she died," Marcus said. His voice had acquired something rough at its edges, the sound of a voice working against something. "She told me something in one of the last letters. She said, 'Take care of my babies.' She called you that. Her babies." He was quiet for a moment. I told myself it was a general kind of thing, an expression. I told myself it didn't mean anything specific. He looked at me directly. "And then my father called me when I got out of prison and told me there was money involved, and I drove here with an envelope, and I told you things I told you." Something shifted in his face. I betrayed her. She was the only person who ever treated me like I was worth something, and I took her trust and I used it against her children. The deck was very still beneath us. The sun had moved west, and the shadows were getting longer, the particular slow gold of a winter afternoon coming toward its end. "The hearing is in 2 weeks," I said. "I know. Are you going to testify for your father?" Marcus was quiet for a long time. long enough that the answer when it came had the weight of something that had been decided through a real process, not a performance. I'm going to testify, he said, against him. I'm going to tell the judge everything. What he asked me to do, what he told me how the whole thing was constructed. He paused. All of it. I looked at him. The professional remove was gone. The rehearsed cadence was gone. The legal envelope voice was gone. What was left was just a man standing on a dock in Nebraska in January deciding who he was going to be. Why'd I ask? He looked at the photograph still in my hands. At my mother's face, her red hair catching the light the way the photograph's aging had preserved it. Because she asked me to take care of you, he said, and it's past time I kept that promise. I handed the photograph back to him. He held it carefully. Then he looked at me with an expression I would think about later, not guilt, exactly, not absolution. Something between the two that doesn't have a clean name. Something that involves having seen yourself from the outside and deciding based on what you saw to be different. I can't give you the years back, he said. I can't fix what I did. No, I agreed, you can't. But I can tell the truth in that courtroom. I looked out at the river. The ice along the banks was retreating millimeter by millimeter, the first evidence of something that would eventually become the river running free. Then tell the truth, I said. The hearing was held on a Tuesday in February. The courtroom in the county seat was a small room with wood panel walls that had absorbed decades of proceedings into the grain of the wood itself, as though justice, when dispensed in sufficient quantities over sufficient time, left a physical residue. Creaking gallery chairs. A judge's bench that had the particular authority of furniture that has been in the same position for a long time and knows it. High windows that let in the flat winter light at an angle that caught the dust in the air and made it briefly visible. Guard Durbin sat at one side of the room with his lawyer, a man from the county seat who had the look of someone who charged by the hour and was currently watching his bill accumulate with professional satisfaction. Guard looked smaller than I remembered from the morning he threw us out. Smaller and older, the way people sometimes look when you encounter them in a formal context, stripped of the informal power that constituted most of their authority. The kitchen, the house, the particular geography of a domestic situation where he was the largest thing in every room, none of that was here. Here he was just a man in a suit that didn't fit quite right, sitting beside a lawyer who was his only remaining asset in the matter at hand. Sully and I sat across the room. No lawyer, we couldn't afford one. We had Ruth Garner beside us, who had come not in any official capacity, but in the capacity of a woman who had decided to be present, which was a different and in some ways more significant thing. What we had instead of a lawyer was witnesses. They came in through the door in ones and twos, finding seats in the gallery behind us, and as they came in, I recognized each of them. Conrad Falwell in a clean shirt, sitting straight in his chair, with the posture of a man who intends to be credible. Marta Falwell beside him, her hands folded. The college students, a brother and sister named Thorne, 20 and 22, who had been hiking the river trail when the storm hit and had found the boat by following their sense of where light would be. The elderly couple, Harold and Bet Pressler, who had come in a car driven by their son and who sat in the gallery with the dignity of people who understand exactly why they are here and consider their presence the least they can do. 15 people total. 15 people who had been inside the shelter while the storm raged outside it. 15 people who knew not from a report or a news story, but from personal direct experience, exactly what Sully and I had built and maintained and offered freely to anyone who needed it, and what it had meant to be on the receiving end of that offering. Judge Margaret Sullivan had silver hair and eyes that moved through a room like a hand moving through water, touching surfaces without disturbing them while reading everything underneath. She had been on this bench for longer than I had been alive, and she carried that tenure not as weight, but as a kind of settled authority, the authority of someone who has seen enough of human behavior in enough of its configurations to have developed a reliable sense of what it actually costs. She looked at Guard Durbin. She looked at his lawyer. She looked at the papers in front of her, then she looked at the gallery. One by one as the witnesses took the stand. They were sworn and they spoke, and what they said was not dramatic, not performed, not constructed for effect. It was simply what had happened. Conrad Falwell described the night his family walked through the stow toward a light they weren't sure was real and found a 17-year-old girl at the door. Bet Presser described a cold that had reached the point where she could no longer feel her feet and a young woman who had sat with her for 2 hours until feeling returned. The Thorne siblings described being shown down a ladder into a room that seemed to have been built by someone who understood with specific precision exactly what they would need. Each account was different in its particulars and the same in its substance. We were in danger. And these two young people helped us, and what they had was extraordinary, and they gave it without condition or calculation. Then Marcus Durbin took the stand. The room changed when he sat down. Not dramatically, it did not change the way a room changes in the stories where a dramatic revelation turns everything on its head. It changed quietly the way a room changes when the thing that has been avoided finally enters it and takes a chair. Guard Durbin looked at his son for a moment and then looked away. And in that brief glance, something was visible that I didn't know how to name, some complicated private transaction between a father and a son that had nothing to do with this courtroom and everything to do with the long history between them. Marcus spoke clearly. He laid out what had happened from the beginning. The phone call when he got out of prison, guards' instructions, the legal strategy, the threat of guardianship proceedings deployed as leverage. He described the insurance settlement and what it had been intended to accomplish. He described the visit to the dock, the envelope, the conversation on the dock with me and Sully. He did not editorialize. He did not perform remorse for the judge's benefit. He simply told the truth, which was what truth looks like when it's told plainly. Not dramatic, not rhetorical, just an accurate account of what happened, offered by the person who had been part of making it happen. When he was finished, the courtroom was quiet in the way that courtrooms are quiet when the last piece has been placed. Judge Sullivan looked at her papers for a long moment. Then she set them down and looked at me. "Miss Ward," she said. Her voice had the particular quality of someone choosing their words with care because the words are going to matter to the person receiving them. "You are 17 years old. In the eyes of the law, you are still a minor, and the law does not permit me to pretend otherwise." She paused. "But in the eyes of this court, what you have demonstrated over the past weeks, the resourcefulness, the judgment, the willingness to use what you had to protect your brother, and then to extend that protection to strangers who needed it, represents a level of maturity and responsibility that many adults I see in this courtroom have not achieved and may not achieve." The room was very still. "I am granting you emancipated minor status effective immediately. You will have full legal control over your mother's insurance settlement." She turned her gaze to Guard Durbin, and whatever warmth had been in her voice when she spoke to me was entirely absent in what came next. "Mr. Durbin, I am issuing a permanent restraining order prohibiting you from any contact with Ellie Ward or Sully Ward. I am additionally referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation into potential fraud involving the misappropriation of state welfare funds." She picked up her gavel. "Court is adjourned." The sound of it coming down was not loud, but it reached everywhere in the room. Sully was beside me and his hand found my arm, the way it had found my arm on the bench outside the diner 3 weeks ago, but the grip was different now. That grip had been fear. This one was something else. Something that didn't have the right word yet, but was the opposite of fear in all the ways that mattered. Ruth Garner on my other side said nothing. She put her hand on my shoulder once briefly and then removed it. That was enough. The week after the hearing was the first week in, as long as I could remember, when I woke up in the morning without a specific emergency to manage. There was work to do. Of course, there was always work to do on the boat, and the storm had created a new inventory of repairs that I was only beginning to understand the full scope of. There were the shelter supplies to fully restock. There were practical arrangements to make about the insurance money, which was now legally mine and needed to go toward things that mattered. There were letters to write and calls to make, and the beginning of the long, unglamorous process of turning a legal status into an actual life. But there was no deadline pressing the air thin. No threat requiring the particular alertness of someone who is always watching for where the next danger is coming from. For the first time in a long time, the space around me was just space. I didn't entirely know what to do with it. Ruth Garner came on the 7th day after the hearing. She came in the late morning, later than her usual visits, and she was carrying something different from what she usually brought. Not food, not supplies, but a small cardboard box, the kind that might hold correspondence, plain brown with no markings on the outside. She set it on the dock railing while she came aboard and then picked it up again and carried it into the cabin. Her face was doing something I hadn't seen it do before. Ruth Garner was not a woman whose face disclosed much. She had lived long enough and through enough that her expressions were generally under good management, showing what she chose to show and keeping the rest available only to herself. But something in the set of her jaw and the particular quality of her stillness told me that what she was carrying mattered to her in a way that was personal. She set the box on the cabin table. "I've been going through things," she said. "Old things. Things I should have sorted years ago and kept putting off." She looked at the box, not at me. When Cord died 5 years ago now, there were things of his that ended up with me. He had no family left to leave anything to, and I was the neighbor who had known him longest, and so some things came my way. She paused. Most of it was practical. Tools, some books, paperwork. I went through all of it at the time and kept what seemed worth keeping and didn't look too hard at the rest. She opened the box, inside an envelope. A single envelope yellowed with age in the specific way that paper yellows when it has been kept in an enclosed space for years, not the yellowing of damage, but of time passing in the dark. It was sealed. On the front in Mallory's handwriting, which I recognized now as well as any handwriting I had ever known a single word. No name, no address, just the word open. Ruth picked it up carefully and held it out to me. "I found it in a tin he had given me years ago," she said. "I thought it was just papers. Tax records, that kind of thing. I never looked carefully. And last week I was cleaning and I opened the tin properly and found this at the bottom." She met my eyes. "I think you need to see it." I took the envelope. I turned it over. The seal had been gummed in the way letters were sealed before everything became self-adhesive, and the gum had dried to the consistency of old paint. I worked the flap open, carefully aware of Ruth standing very still beside me, aware of Sully in the doorway, where he had appeared without sound. Inside was a photograph, black and white printed on the paper stock of the early 1960s, slightly smaller than standard, with the particular tonal quality of photography from that era that makes everything in it look slightly more deliberate than it actually was. It showed a man. He was perhaps 30 years old in the photograph, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who worked with his body, standing on the deck of a boat that I recognized. This deck, this boat, these railings, the same river, visible beyond. He was looking not at the camera, but slightly to the side of it, at something just outside the frame, and his expression had the particular warmth of someone looking at something they love, with the direct, uncomplicated attention of a person who doesn't feel the need to moderate their feelings about it. In his arms was a child, a little girl perhaps 5 or 6 years old. She was turned toward the camera with the whole body engagement of a young child who has decided the camera is interesting and is applying to it the same complete attention she applied to everything. She had freckles across her nose. She was grinning with the gap-toothed grin of a child who has recently lost a tooth and considers this an achievement worth broadcasting. And her hair, even in black and white, even in the tonal range of a photograph taken 60 years ago on equipment, nothing like what exists now, her hair had a quality that the photograph had somehow preserved. A brightness. A way of catching the light that made it visible, even in grayscale, even without color, the way certain things announce themselves regardless of the conditions. I turned the photograph over. The back had been written on in pencil. Mallory's handwriting steady here. This was earlier before the hands had started to slow. 2 lines. "Luella Mallory, my daughter, 6 years old, the light of my life." And beneath that in slightly smaller letters, as though added after the first line was already written, "I could not save her. But someday I will save someone else's daughter. That is my promise." I held the photograph. I held it for a long time, long enough that the cabin had gone very quiet and the river sounds outside were the only sound in the room. Then Ruth spoke, and her voice was the quietest I had ever heard it. "You have the same hair," she said, "the same color, the same quality in the light." She paused. "I noticed it the first day I came to the dock, when I saw you standing there with your red hair in the January cold." She paused again, and when she spoke again, her voice had something in it that was not quite words, something that lived in the space between what can be said and what is simply felt. I've been thinking about it since then, about what it might mean, about whether there is such a thing as an accident in the way that certain people arrive in certain places at certain times. I looked at the photograph of Luella Mallory, 6 years old, freckles, a smile that generated its own warmth that seemed to come from somewhere inside her that had nothing to do with the weather around her. Red hair that caught the light. I touched my own hair with one hand, the automatic gesture of someone confirming the reality of something they already know. Sully made a sound, not a word, something smaller, something that came from the place where words haven't formed yet, but the feeling is already there. I set the photograph down carefully on the cabin table. I looked at it for another moment. Then I looked out the window at the river, at the Missouri River, moving between its banks with the patient indifference of something that has been doing this for 10,000 years and expects to keep doing it for 10,000 more. At the landscape that held all of this, the boat, the dock, the ground that concealed the shelter, the lives that had been spent and saved and spent and again on this particular bend, in this particular river. I thought about a man in a flooded valley in 1967 standing on high ground after the water receded, looking for two people he would not find. I thought about the years that followed, the quiet work, the concrete walls poured in sections and sealed, the shelving built and stocked and labeled with dates, the letter written by hands that had started to shake, sealed in a box under the floorboards waiting. I thought about $30 laid on a counter in the Benton Falls Town Hall, and the deed that came back across that counter, and the way everything that followed had the quality of something that had been prepared for long before anyone involved understood what was being prepared. I thought about Luella Mallory, 6 years old, who never got to grow up, never got to fall in love, never got to bring her own red-haired children to stand on this deck and look at this river. She never got any of it. But her father had spent the rest of his life in an act of continuous love on her behalf, building a place where other people's daughters could survive the water when it rose. And there was something in that, something about the way love moves when it can no longer go where it intended to go and has to find another path. I whispered something to the photograph, to the little girl in it who was also somehow connected to the old man who had built everything beneath our feet. A word or two barely voiced the kind of thing you say when you know it can't be heard and say it anyway because the saying is for you as much as for the person it's addressed to. I thought in the quiet after that it was enough, that whatever had brought us here, the $30, the door in the frozen ground, the letter in the sealed box, it had been enough. Spring came slowly to Benton Falls the way spring comes to Nebraska, not arriving so much as gradually replacing what had been there, the snow, giving ground inch by inch to the warming soil, the river releasing its ice in stages, the flat landscape emerging from its white cover like something that had been sleeping and was now deciding with deliberate unhurriedness to wake. We used the insurance money carefully. A new roof, a real roof, not the storm plastic and salvaged lumber solution we had lived under through the winter, but properly sealed and rated installed by a contractor out of the county seat who was astonished by the quality of the boat's underlying frame and said so several times with a professional appreciation of someone who knows good construction when they find it and doesn't often find it in this condition in something this old. New windows, a proper heating system, not the potbelly stove which remained and was excellent, but a supplemental system that would make the boat livable in even the worst Nebraska winters without requiring constant vigilance. The shelter was fully restocked, the rotation system updated, the generator serviced, and replaced where necessary. We put up a sign at the landing road visible from the county road, simple enough, Crane's Landing Boat Emergency Shelter. Ruth Garner's idea and the right one. Word spread the way. Word spreads in a small county where everyone knows everyone and stories travel fast. In a story about two teenagers who sheltered 25 people through the worst winter storm in 30 years travels faster than most. People came to see. Not many at first, a few curious neighbors, someone who had heard the story at the Benton Falls Diner and wanted to see for himself. Then more. A reporter from the county paper who wrote a story that was careful and factual and somehow still managed to miss the most important parts, the way journalism often misses the most important parts of things that are fundamentally about the interior life rather than the external facts. A county emergency management official came in April, a practical man named Henderson, who walked through the shelter with the assessment eye of someone who has been evaluating emergency preparedness infrastructure for 20 years and does not impress easily. He came out of the shelter and stood on the dock and was quiet for a moment. "Who designed this?" he asked. A man named Cord Mallory, I said. He died in 1989. He started building it in 1968. Henderson was quiet for another moment. He knew what he was doing. Yes, I said, he did. The county provided a formal designation that summer, a registered community emergency shelter with all the legal and logistical status that designation carried, funding for ongoing maintenance, a training program for county residents on how to use the facilities and supplies run out of the shelter itself on 3 Saturday mornings in August, attended by 47 people who sat on the concrete floor of Mallory's bunker and listened and asked questions and left with a working knowledge of what was available and how to reach it. Captain Cord Mallory's dream had found its operational form. We named the place officially that fall. Sully came up with the name the way Sully came up with things quietly without announcement, arriving at a conclusion by a process the rest of the room could not follow and presenting the result once it was complete. He came to me one afternoon when the light was going gold on the river and the air was beginning to have the first edge of autumn in it. "We should call it Mallory Harbor," he said. I thought about it for about 3 seconds. Then I said yes. The sign went up the following week, a proper sign, not the emergency marker on the county road, but a real one made from a piece of hardwood that Sully had found in the boat's storage hold, and plain flat, and painted himself, the letters routed with a borrowed tool and filled with black paint that dried to a matte finish. Mallory Harbor Cranes Landing, Benton Falls, Nebraska. Ruth Garner stood on the dock the afternoon we put it up and looked at it for a long time. She had the photograph with her, she had given it to me, but she had been holding it again that afternoon, looking at it the way you look at something that contains more than its surface shows. She put it in my hands. "Keep it," she said. "Keep it somewhere, you'll see it." I did. The years that followed built themselves the way years do, one thing at a time, each thing resting on the one before it, the whole structure emerging gradually from what looked at any given moment like ordinary days. Sully finished high school. He finished near the top of his class, which surprised no one who had paid attention and surprised several people who hadn't. He was 17 when he showed me what he had been drawing in the sketchbook since the night of the storm, since before that, actually since the first time he had gone through the shelter carefully and sat down at Mallory's desk and begun to understand the design logic of what was there. He had been drawing shelters, not copies of Mallory's design, variations, improvements, adaptations for different soil conditions, different climate zones, different scale requirements. He had been doing this for months in the margins of whatever time the days allowed, with the focused patience he brought to everything that mattered to him. He spread the pages out on the cabin table, and I looked at them one by one. They were extraordinary. Not because they were perfect, they weren't, not yet. They were the work of a 17-year-old who was reasoning through problems he had not been formally trained to solve, and the gaps showed. But the underlying intelligence was unmistakable. The way he had understood Mallory's design principles, the relationship between the structure and the earth, the ventilation logic, the use of thermal mass, and extended them. The way he had thought about what Mallory's design could not do and worked out directions for improvement. "I want to study architecture," he said. He said it in the same quiet way he said most important things, without preamble, presenting it as a conclusion he had already reached and was now reporting. "I want to design places like this, places that protect people when everything else fails." He was accepted to the State University program 2 years later. He was 20 years old and he left for Lincoln in August with his sketchbooks and his borrowed drafting tools and the photograph of Mallory's bunker cross-section that he had taped to the inside cover of his main sketchbook when he was 15 years old and had kept there ever since. I drove him to the bus station in the county seat. We stood on the sidewalk in the August heat with his bags around us and the bus idling 20 feet away, and there was a moment between us. Not awkward, not anything that required management. Just a moment. The weight of everything that had brought us to this sidewalk this morning, these separate directions we were now facing. "Go," I said. He went. I stood on the sidewalk until the bus was out of sight. Then I drove back to Cranes Landing to the boat to the harbor that bore a dead man's name, and I went down the ladder into the shelter, and I sat at Mallory's desk in the deep quiet of the earth, and I let the feeling move through me that had no name yet, but would have one eventually. Something complete, something that had taken a long time to arrive, and had arrived now fully without reservation. I am 22 years old as I write this. I have been running Mallory Harbor for 3 years. Not alone Ruth helps, as she has always helped with the particular efficiency of someone who identifies what is needed and provides it without ceremony. A rotating group of county volunteers has grown up around the shelter people who come on Saturday mornings and help with maintenance and restocking and the training sessions we run for whoever comes. Conrad Falwell comes twice a year with his family, and his oldest boy, who was 8 years old in the shelter, can now run the generator checklist from memory. Bet Pressler knitted us blankets for the shelter that winter more than we needed, and we accepted all of them. The shelter has been used 3 more times. A tornado in 1991 that came through the county on a Tuesday afternoon in May with 45 minutes of warning, during which 21 people from the surrounding area arrived at Mallory Harbor and went underground. A flood in 1993, not as bad as 1967, not the worst the Missouri had ever produced, but bad enough that the low-bank properties were underwater for 9 days, and 7 families spent that time in the shelter, with adequate food and water and heat, while their fields absorbed the damage. And last winter, a blizzard that came closer to the 1990 storm than anyone had predicted, during which the shelter housed 31 people for 6 days. No one died. Not once in any of the events did anyone in the shelter die. I think about this number often. I think about what it represents, not just the living, but the preparation that made the living possible. The 20 years of quiet work by a man most of the town thought had gone strange with grief. The nearly 2 decades of stocking and checking and replacing and maintaining that nobody saw and nobody thanked him for, and nobody understood until the moment it mattered. The photograph of Luella Mallory sits on the desk in the shelter. I put it there 2 years ago, framed in a simple frame I made from wood, salvaged from one of the boat's original cabinets. Her red hair, her freckles, her gap-toothed smile aimed at a camera she found more interesting than frightening. Her father's arm around her, his face turned slightly away, looking at something just outside the frame. Every time I go down the ladder, she is there. I have told her things over the years in the quiet of the shelter when no one else was present, things she will never hear, things that matter anyway. I have told her what her father built and what it has done, and how many times the door in the earth has opened to let someone in. I have told her that her hair color and mine have nothing to do with anything, and possibly everything to do with everything, and that I am not sure those two things are different. I have told her that her father's promise was kept. Marcus Durbin came back to Benton Falls once about a year after the hearing. He came on a Tuesday in late autumn, drove out to the landing in a truck I didn't recognize, parked at the end of the road. He walked down the dock the way a person walks when they are not sure of their reception and have decided to come anyway. He was working construction, he said. Honest work, steady work, the kind that left his hands tired at the end of the day in a way that felt deserved. He had moved 2 counties east, had nothing to do with his father, who was still working through the legal proceedings that the district attorney's investigation had produced. He stood on the dock and looked at the sign. Mallory Harbor, he said, something in his voice when he said it that was not just reading. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Your mother would have liked that name. I think so too. He looked at the river for a while. Then he looked at me with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of someone who has put down a burden they were carrying and has found the world somewhat lighter without it. I'm trying to be better, he said. Every day, trying to be the person she believed I could be. I know. He nodded. He turned to leave. Then he stopped. Ellie. Yes. She would be proud of you. He said it without embellishment, without performance, just the fact of it. Both of you, she would be so proud. He walked up the dock and got in his truck and drove away. I watched him go until the truck disappeared, where the landing road met the county road. Then I turned around and walked back to the boat. I walked out to the dock this morning before the sun was fully up. The Missouri was running high with the spring snowmelt, its surface moving in the flat gray of pre-dawn, with the purposeful energy of water that has somewhere to go and is going there. The ice is completely gone now, last week's warmth saw to that, and the river is itself again moving and brown and indifferent and entirely alive. I stood on the dock in the early cold with my mother's photograph in one hand and Luella Mallory's photograph in the other. 2 women who shaped the direction of a life they never got to see. My mother, who died too young in a hospital bed and spent her remaining strength writing letters to a stranger in prison, because she believed that everyone deserves someone in their corner. Who named me as the beneficiary of a policy she took out when she was still healthy enough to think about what would come after her, and in doing so put $30 in my pocket at exactly the right moment. Luella, who was 6 years old when the water took her, and whose father spent every year after her building the thing that would eventually bring me here, whose hair and mine in photographs 60 years apart catch the light in the same way. Whether that means something, or whether it is simply the kind of coincidence that seems to mean something when you are standing on a dock at dawn, is not a question I've answered. I am not sure it requires an answer. The river moved below me. A bird called from somewhere in the tree line to the east, the first bird of the morning testing the air, with its voice the way birds test things completely, without reservation, without any apparent concern for whether the world is ready for it. I held both photographs. I stood there as the sky began to change color and the light came up over the flat horizon, and the day arrived the way days arrive in Nebraska, without ceremony, without apology, simply present, where darkness had been full of the possibility and the work that every day carries equally, whether you are ready for it or not. Sully called last week from Lincoln. He has been working on his thesis project, a modular underground shelter system designed for rural communities in flood-prone regions, deployable with standard construction equipment and materials available in any rural county. He has been working on it for 2 years, refining it, consulting with engineers, testing the thermal calculations against what we learned from Mallory's original design. He told me about it with the contained excitement of someone who has been holding something close for a long time and is ready to let it into the open. It works, he said. The numbers work. The design is sound. Of course it is, I said. He laughed. I'm going to name the design methodology after him. In the thesis, the Mallory method, if that's all right. I thought about a man at a metal desk in a concrete shelter writing in a journal by lamplight in 1975, describing a project that made no sense to anyone who looked at it from outside, writing about the things he couldn't control and the things he could, and choosing carefully to spend his available years on the latter. It's all right, I said. He'd have liked that. After I hung up, I went down into the shelter. I sat at the desk. I looked at the photograph. I thought, this is what love does when it can't go where it meant to go. It finds another path. It keeps moving. It arrives eventually somewhere it was needed. $30. That is where the story starts. That is the number on the deed in the filing cabinet at the Benton Falls Town Hall. The deed that transferred a houseboat from the town's unclaimed property inventory to a 17-year-old girl with red hair and $47 and nowhere else to turn. $30 did not buy a boat. What it bought was a door set into the ground at 40 paces north, sealed against time, waiting for whoever would come with the need and the willingness to pull it open and climb down into the dark and find what a grieving man had spent the best years of his life preparing. What it bought was a harbor, not in the nautical sense, not as a place where boats are safe from weather, but in the other sense, the older sense, the one that means a place where people are safe from whatever is pursuing them. The harbor you make for others because someone once made one for you, or because no one made one for you and you understand from the inside exactly what it costs when there isn't one. What it bought was the understanding that some things are bigger than the people who carry them, that a dead man's love for a 6-year-old girl with red hair could save 22 people from a blizzard and continue saving people after that in ways he never anticipated and could not have planned for, that the things we build for others outlast us. That love, when it is the kind that refuses to be stopped by the thing that would stop it, finds its way forward somehow, through whatever ground it has to move through until it surfaces somewhere it was needed. I stood on the dock this morning and I held 2 photographs, and I watched the sun come up over the Missouri River, and somewhere in the quality of the morning light on the moving water, in the particular way the river caught the early sun and threw it back, I felt it not as a thought, not as a conclusion, but as something more direct, more immediate, more like the way you feel temperature or the weight of something in your hands. I am here because Cord Mallory loved his daughter, because he lost her and could not stop, would not stop, chose not to stop, because he kept moving in the only direction left to him, which was forward, which was the future, which was a door in the ground at 40 paces north and a letter to whoever was coming. I am here because my mother loved people she had no obligation to love, including a young man in a prison 2 counties over, whom she visited because she believed everyone deserved someone. Because she was careful and practical, even when her body was failing her, and she named her oldest daughter as the beneficiary of a policy that would eventually become $30 on a counter in a town hall in Benton Falls, Nebraska. I am here because Sully kept his sketchbook, because he drew the things he saw and the things he imagined and the things that existed in the space between, and because those drawings were connected in ways none of us understood yet to a design methodology that will eventually be named after a dead man and taught to engineers who will use it to build shelters in places that need them. Some things are bigger than the people who carry them. The river kept moving. The bird in the tree line kept calling. The sun kept rising in the way the sun always rises, indifferent to everything except the fact of the rising, the simple continuity of it, the day that comes after the night, with the same reliable certainty that the water comes after the ice. I put my mother's photograph in my coat pocket close to my chest where I have always kept it. I put Luella Mallory's photograph in my other pocket. I walked back to the boat. There was work to do.